Right, so President Cyril Ramaphosa has concluded his working visit to Egypt with an appeal to the international community to do more in enabling the revival of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The president traveled to Cairo, Egypt, to attend the Summit for Peace at the invitation of Egyptian President Abdel Fattah El-Sisi. Ramaphosa says that more energy must be directed at supporting the resumption of the peace process. He says that influential countries like the US have a responsibility to support processes that will develop and deliver long-lasting and durable peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians at large. So to take this discussion further, we're going to be joined via Teams by Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, international relations analyst. Prof, good afternoon, and thank you for your time with us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon.
Prof, at this point, given what's transpired, we've seen sentiments about peace coming through. President Cyril Ramaphosa really going strong and hard on that stance. What has your thought been on the peace summit that was underway in Egypt?
You know, the peace summit was a big summit to demonstrate that what is happening in Gaza is actually a horrendous activity. And I think, as the president was putting it, it defies all kinds of normalcy or of common sense, really. And therefore, the 12 leaders who gathered in Cairo really were saying we need an even-handed approach to this conflict, because the efforts at the UN to condemn Israel, to get a ceasefire, have failed. So why can't we now have a group of 12 countries representing very different shades of opinion to drum the message that it's important for a negotiated peace settlement to this conflict? And this is precisely the message that President Ramaphosa said. He said, without peace, there's not going to be security for Israel. Neither are we going to have stability and dignity for the Palestinian people. But the problem with the summit, it was just a one-day summit. And therefore, there hasn't been what you would call a real follow-up on that summit, because it was simply to come up and say, we need a position that returns the international community to the root causes of this conflict, which is the alienation of the Palestinians. And therefore, we need to get back to the 1967 agreement that says that we need two states, Israel and Palestine. This issue has disappeared from global conversation. So the attack now and the ongoing crisis demonstrate the importance of going back to that agreement of 1967 and say we need to resolve this issue, and we can no longer begin to hide under the sand that this Palestinian issue has gone away. And so it was important to have a summit of that nature.
Prof, let's get into the, some of the agreements, even the resolutions taken upon by the UN Security Council. Perhaps you could speak to that, given how things have escalated at this point. What is the mandate or the role of the UNSC at this point, given the resolutions that have come to the fore? Are they falling apart? You've now alluded to the two-state solution, the agreement of 1967. I wonder, at this point, also giving the timings of the escalations, if the politics of the matter is actually going to finally be addressed.
At the UN Security Council, the priority has been a ceasefire, because we are facing a crisis, huge humanitarian crisis. And this cannot, in fact, be resolved without Israelis beginning to step back from their bombing and their threats, in fact, to invade Gaza through ground troops. And you can see that there is ongoing bombardment of Gaza, in fact, to smithereens. So the Security Council is saying we need a ceasefire as of now. But the issue has been, the United States has been very uncomfortable with that position, because they believe that that position doesn't really address the ills committed by Hamas and the continuing threats of Hamas to the Israelis. So they have been the ones actually who've been, with their partners in the West, the Western countries have been very adamant that Israel should actually be given a blank check to continue to do what it's doing in the Gaza. So the UN Security Council is stalemated, because if you have the veto, especially exercised by the US and the Western countries in the Security Council, there's no movement there. And therefore, it is difficult to have a ceasefire, to call for ceasefire through the UN Security Council, because it's been vetoed already.
Yeah.
And there's no sense at which it is actually we're going to get a breakthrough through the United Nations Security Council.
And so, Prof, looking at other, alternatives or avenues at this point, how would you weigh in on the involvement of Africa to date? Some questioning whether African countries are on the fence about the matter at hand. We've seen a rise of protests from civil society standing in solidarity, both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine. And I wonder if you could weigh in on what messaging is also being communicated at this front, given that some are also obviously calling for the intensified role of the BDS movement at large.
I think the broader message that is coming from the ground, and I'm talking about Africa in general, but also globally, is that Israel is committing crimes in the Gaza, and that it's unspeakable that in this day and age, populations of about 2.3 million people would be starved of food and energy and electricity and health. So what we need to do, therefore, I think the broader condemnation of these actions are giving citizens the kind of power to begin to force their government to do things more than, I think, the message coming out of the EFF, for instance, is that South Africa should do more to, in fact, punish Israel because of these very actions. But you recall that South Africa has already downgraded its relationship with Israel. But what the EFF, and I suspect the majority of the African populations are calling for, is essentially the isolation and the sanctions of the Israelis. Because the bombing and the siege of Gaza really looks very bad. And it's a heinous crime, and it resonates with so many people who believe that, in fact, Israel is set to annihilate the Palestinians from the face of the earth. So I don't know whether this kind of pressure from below, from the citizens, is going to force governments, for instance, to begin to have more forceful measures against Israel. The only country now that has cut diplomatic relations with Israel stemming from this Gaza crisis is Colombia in South America. The EFF seems to suggest that South Africa, in fact, should be going that direction, but I really don't know whether that is going to be feasible at this point.
Well, Prof,
everybody still hopes that there will be a peaceful approach to the conflict.
No, absolutely, because time is running out and we only have time left to see what remains. So we're obviously going to have to monitor developments on that front. Some questioning activists as passive resistance. All this obviously on the back of that peace summit that happened in Egypt. We're looking at Africa's involvement and the escalations of protests, perhaps from the country, civil society at large, standing in solidarity as we look at and shine a spotlight on the Israel-Hamas conflict. Again, thanks to Prof. Gilbert Khadiagala for those sentiments.